IQ, a score on a test, a number that most of us have been labeled with ever since our school days. Does that number mean, A, how much intelligence you've got, B, the ability you're born with, C, your potential for success? The answer is D, none of the above. I'm Dan Rather, and this is a report on that complex of myths called IQ. I for intelligence, Q for quotient. The subject of controversies that have spilled out of academic circles and into the public forum. Controversies involving race, schools, and jobs. Because IQ tests are grossly misunderstood and widely misused. This is our subject, and here's what we'll show you. First, the tests themselves. What's in them, what's behind them, what's wrong with them. Second, how IQ tests have been involved in our history, in military service, in government policies and programs. And third, how IQ tests are still being used and misused to shape our children's lives.
I think there's been an awful lot of stress on IQ, and I don't really know if it measures all that much. I think if you can see that a child is working to his fullest, that he's really trying, he's plugging, he's putting everything into it, his IQ really doesn't matter.
I think that the intelligence test score was the most effective device ever invented by the middle class to oppress the poor and keep them in their place. And it had the beauty of seeming very democratic.
CBS reports the IQ myth with correspondent Dan Rather.
A secretive industry, guarding its products against imitation and even against publicity, distributing them under seal like government documents or Academy Award ballots. This is the IQ business, one branch of the publishing industry. There are 4 major firms and at least 20 smaller ones, producing dozens of different competing versions of intelligence tests. It's a highly specialized form of publishing. In one observer's phrase, all question marks and dollar signs. Its best-selling authors, all of them psychologists like Dr. David Wexler of New York, earn royalties estimated as high as $150,000 a year. The test-writing team of Thorndike and Hagen, as well known in this field as Masters and Johnson are in theirs. In the school systems of every state in the Union, one form of intelligence test or another, sometimes several different tests, are given each year to at least 10 million children of all ages.
Augustino.
The impact on their lives can be enormous.
Robinson. David. David Frazier. Beth. All right, this morning, children, we're going to use these little booklets to play some puzzles.
Far from a game, this may be a fateful experience. For how well or how badly they do with those little puzzles will be recorded in a score, a number that will become part of their identity, an image, good or otherwise. For a man named Gregory Ochoa, now a successful member of his profession, it was like a life sentence.
Well, I was told that I wouldn't be able to do very much in life, that essentially I would be able to do manual labor, unskilled labor, the kinds of things that migrant workers do and that Mexicans, in quotes, are expected to do.
There are many Americans for whom a low score on an IQ test has meant being relegated to low-status trades. A high IQ has opened doors to good colleges, and from there, to high-income careers. For several generations of American men, it also meant the difference between a college deferment and getting shot at. A life and death difference. All based on a score on a test whose meaning is limited, whose results are easily misinterpreted.
This booklet contains 5 tests which will give you a chance to show what you know and how well you think.
It is not supposedly a test of what they learned in some particular course, like math or history. That's an achievement test. This is a general intelligence test, also known as mental abilities or cognitive abilities.
11 on your answer sheet. Ready? Begin.
By any name, it's an IQ test, and it just might stump you if you were taking it with these sixth graders in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. If it didn't stump you, at least it would surprise you. In the first place, it involves forms of intelligence you may have forgotten you ever had or needed, like these analogies. The first figure is to the second figure, as the third figure is to which? The correct answer is C. Noon is to midnight, as sunset is to what? As sunset is to sea, dawn. Another surprising thing, there is more purely factual stuff than you may recall. Names, facts, figures. Like this. If 3.5 tons of scrap iron are sold for $140, what is the selling price per ton? Now, have you done the arithmetic? The answer, of course, is E, none of these prices. Here's a question that looks as if you could reason it out, but you really have to know an old saying. No garden is without its weeds.
Well, sometimes you say, well, this one looks good, but so does this one. Which one do I pick? So you have to go eeny, meeny, miny, mo. You use your judgment.
Like she said, you have to pick each one, and one looks good, and the other one does too. So you have to try to get it just right.
That's the most surprising thing. While there's only one right answer, there may be other good answers. Pick the animal that fits best with the 4 examples at the top. Could be deer, like the other animals, they have hooves. Could even be rabbit, like the others, they're sometimes raised on farms. But the only answer you'd get credit for is dog, because they too are domesticated animals. Even the author or co-author of that question wasn't sure of the answer until he checked it. That's Professor Robert Thorndike of Columbia University.
With many of the questions, it seems that there can be more than one correct answer. Is this the case?
Yes, this is certainly the case in items other than, say, the quantitative item. More in some types of items, I think, than others. Hopefully there is always a best answer, and your instruction to the youngster is typically to choose the best answer.
Group intelligence tests are the kind that most people have taken, a whole class at a time, and when it's over, you are whatever you have put on paper. No allowance for nerves or a headache, no credit for good reasons behind a wrong answer, perhaps even an ingenious answer. The scoring of the tests is impersonal, mechanical. What that IQ score means is simply this: how the child ranks among children the same age who have taken the same test. 100 means an average number of right answers. 145 means you out-answered 99% of your age group. 2 out of 3 children will score between 85, low average, and 115, high average. High IQ or low. What that number does not mean is how much you've got of some overall natural ability called intelligence. That, says Professor Jerome Kagan of Harvard, is too complex to sum up in a word, let alone a number.
I don't think it accurately captures the diversity and variety in human intellectual functioning that exists. I don't believe there's a general mental ability so that a person who is good at memorizing sentences or poems will necessarily be intelligent or good or proficient at sailing a yacht, at fixing a carburetor, at being a surgeon. The notion of intelligence assumes that if there's a general ability, and that if you're good on one, you should be generally good on all.
Even in its primitive stages, when it drew maps of the mind and red bumps on the skull, even then, psychology recognized dozens of different mental skills and functions. Modern researchers have identified as many as 150. And of that number, IQ tests are said to measure only about 5 or 6. Among the forms of intelligence that tests do not measure is creativity, the force behind great art and brilliant inventions. Nor do they measure the ability to diagnose a problem, mechanical or human, to analyze causes and come up with a solution. None of this is tested by the questions, and none of it shows in the score of a group intelligence test. It might show in the kind of test called an individual IQ, given by a trained psychologist one-on-one, when they are given. Usually that's just when some special learning problem has come to the school's attention, and then only in some schools.
Who invented the electric light bulb? Think you know that?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Talk about it in school.
Yeah, that's...
This kind of test, too, has its limitations. For both forms, the test makers tell us, the questions are based on the experience of the average American child, in school and outside. Average meaning middle class. And it's economic class that marks the main dividing line on IQ scores. Middle-class children tend to do well in general, whatever their ethnic or racial background. They are the group the tests are geared to. Lower-class children, blacks, Chicanos, and whites, all tend to do poorly. The tests are slanted against their social and cultural background. One of the psychologists who has been calling public attention to this built-in cultural bias is Dr. Robert Williams of Washington University in St. Louis. He cites an example from the Wechsler individual IQ test.
What is the thing to do if a boy or a girl much smaller than yourself starts to fight with you? Now, in our society, black communities, a child is told that if another child hits him, hit him back.
Well, what is the recommended response to
It's
that?
restraint, not to do anything. Walk away, but never to hit him back.
Test author David Wechsler.
What should you do if a little boy, much smaller than you, starts a fight? Now, I'll give you the answer, so that we don't get... The answer is don't pursue it. Don't let him alone. Tell him to... Now, we had protests, especially from the people in underprivileged areas where there's all... They said, the thing to do is to bust him in the jaw. And I says, that's true, and give the child credit if he comes from home. But if he comes from Park Avenue, it's not a good answer, and vice versa.
You think your test is absolutely fair, whether the child comes from Harlem, or from Appalachia, or from Park Avenue?
If you take that into consideration.
In practice, a child's cultural background is rarely taken into account, even on an individual IQ test. Until lately, in fact, that was strictly forbidden. What's a barometer? A mantis? Hieroglyphics? Instead of questions like that, some black psychologists say, what if ghetto children were asked about words and objects from their own experience and culture? What if middle-class people were tested with questions based on ghetto life? Like Mother's Day is, Black Independence Day, a day when mothers are honored, the day the welfare checks come, or every first Sunday in church. It's the day the welfare checks come. Hawk means rain, sunshine, water, or cold wind. It's D, cold wind. Deuce and a quarter refers to what? Money, a car, a house, dice? It's a car, the Buick Electra 225. Those are some questions from a special black culture intelligence test devised by Dr. Williams.
Well, I could go through here and show how many of these items have originated in the community. There's a rich quality to them. There's a uniqueness to them. You see, now deuce and a quarter has French in it. 2 and a quarter. You can teach children math that way, can't you?
But is that equivalent to the Wechsler and Binet tests in testing intelligence?
Well, let's take another one.
Is that a tough question for a black child?
Not many of these are really tough questions for black children. See, I'm of the opinion that an IQ test doesn't really have to have all tough questions. You can give a child a wide range of questions, and if he answers all of them, that is sufficient to tell me that he's smart enough to make it in this society.
Dr. Kenneth Clark, New York educator and psychologist.
Doctor, would you see any value in a special black IQ test?
Absolutely not. I see no more value in a special black IQ test than I would in a special black isolation Bantu compound. The purposes of tests, as I see them, is to give us some indication of the ability of the individual to function in the larger culture. I cannot accept the fact that there would be any isolated black culture that would make any damn sense at all.
While he's against any black intelligence test, Dr. Clark also sees the standard tests as unfair because education is unequal.
When we subject black children, as systematically as we do, to exclusion from certain academic experiences, and then test them to see the extent to which they're able to cope with those experiences that you've excluded them from, then this is a double bind. The scores on the test are low is because they have not been exposed to the same educational or life experiences that more privileged children are. To that extent, I would say it's biased. I mean, and it's so flagrantly biased that it seemed to me embarrassing to even have to talk about it.
Among most psychologists, black and white, even among most test authors, the bias of intelligence tests is an accepted fact. And the fact has been given legal support by a federal court in California in a ruling that limits the way schools in that state may use test scores in classifying black children. So IQ tests are not the pure things most of us assumed they were. They are tilted and also inexact, rather heavy on mere facts, and at the same time open to different answers. Then how much does that IQ number mean? What can it really tell about a person? Back to Harvard's Professor Kagan.
It tells someone the degree to which this person has acquired the vocabulary, the style of thinking, and the familiarity with the intellectual problems of middle-class Western world. Now, that's not unimportant. I mean, that's a very important piece of information to have. And that's why it predicts grades in school and college so well.
But does it measure inherited ability?
Then we go back to our earlier discussion. Is there a thing like an inherited ability, or are there abilities? And if you share, and if you're on the side that says there are abilities, then my answer is no, it cannot, because it is too narrow a sample of all the mental or intellectual functions man is capable of.
IQ, in other words, is mainly a talent for schoolwork, an ability that can be developed, especially if you start at an early enough age. That's what most psychologists seem to be telling us. Still, the myths about IQ persist, affecting popular attitudes about intelligence, education, nationality, race, even affecting the laws under which this nation has lived. Almost from their beginnings in turn-of-the-century France, IQ tests contained the seeds of a controversy. How should the tests be used? That was a time of expansive social change. Public education was growing. The government wanted to make schooling more efficient by picking out the slow learners and putting them in separate classes. The man they commissioned to do the job, a pioneer psychologist named Alfred Binet, saw it as a chance to benefit the individual pupil, to diagnose problems so the child could get special help. The result was the first IQ test, with questions like these. What does this picture represent? The answer, unhappiness. What is missing from each face? An eye, the mouth, the nose. And, one that may sound familiar, when you've been hit by a friend unintentionally, what should you do? World War I was the beginning of widespread use of the tests in this country. American psychologists had translated Binet's concept, but changed the emphasis from individual to mass testing, a fast way of deciding who should be an officer and who shouldn't, who should work at a desk and who should be cannon fodder. The tests were now being used as a social instrument, a way to classify people rather than help individuals. It was done with questions such as these. Unscramble the sentence and mark whether it is true or false. Every triangle has 4 sides. False. A word analogy. Establish is to begin, as abolish is to end is correct. In the World War I test, as today, many of the questions required specific information. Velvet Joe appears in advertisements of, the correct answer is, or was, tobacco. What the results seemed to say about Americans was startling and puzzling. Blacks as a group scored 15 points lower than whites. But blacks in some northern states scored higher than whites in parts of the South. Most striking, over half the draftees were classified as having a mental age of less than 13. The classifiers didn't take into account that most of the recruits hadn't gotten past 5th grade. The menace of the feeble-minded. That phrase became the basis of laws aimed at clamping the lid on America's melting pot. IQ tests had already come a long way, in the wrong direction, according to Princeton psychologist Leon Kamen.
Well, I think that the people who translated and imported Binet's test to the United States in the 5 or 10 years following 1905 had very different points of view and very different attitudes than Binet himself had. They believed, quite aside from the test, that intelligence, in quotes, was a highly heritable trait, that some people were born bright, other people were born stupid. They believed that the national intelligence was declining because they felt that the bright people were not having enough children, whereas the dull people were having too many children. They were worried about the future of intelligence in American society, and so on. What, in fact, happened was this. As early as 1912, Henry Goddard, who was one of the original importers and translators of Binet test, was invited by the United States Public Health Service to take the test to Ellis Island, which was the immigrant receiving station in New York Harbor, through which almost all immigrants to the United States from Europe passed. And he reported that having tested a representative sample of incoming immigrants, 83% of Jews, 79% of Russians, and 87% of Italians were feeble-minded. It was pointed out to the Congress again and again that immigrants from southeastern Europe were genetically inferior, so far as IQ is concerned, to Nordic immigrants from northwestern Europe. And indeed, when Congress passed an immigration law in 1924, it embodied for the first time what were called national origin quotas.
What you've outlined here is a fairly long history in this country of IQ tests being used as a foundation of racism.
Yeah, I think that's an unfortunate but correct historical reading. I'm not talking about the motivations of the people who produce these tests. I'm talking about the objective consequences which the tests have had. Now, I think in retrospect, it's quite clear that the Italians in the United States at that time tended mostly to be recent immigrants, not familiar with the language of the United States, not familiar with the culture of the United States. The tests were biased against their kind of background. Therefore, they got low scores. And it seems quite transparent to me that the same is probably true of black Americans today.
Don't support racism. Don't support racism.
IQ as a racial issue, one that has been heating up college campuses periodically for the last few years. Usually it's in protest against appearances by William Shockley, physicist turned social critic, leading popularizer of the idea that intelligence is basically a matter of race. An old theory originally revived by psychologist Arthur Johnson of the University of California.
Is it fair to say that your position has been that black Americans as a race are not as intelligent as whites?
By my definition of intelligence, yes, I would say that's a fair statement.
Do you still believe that?
I still believe that, yes. I believe it more strongly now than I did in 1969 when I suggested that as a hypothesis, because I've seen much more evidence on this since then. I've been researching this point in the several years since then. I should point out, of course, that there is a large area of overlap between the two racial groups. One can't forget that point. We're talking about an average difference of 15 points. And an average difference of 15 points means that approximately 15% of the black population exceeds the white median. 15% of the blacks are above the average white. 85% are below.
It is a fact, as Jensen says, that black children on the average score 15 points lower than whites in IQ. As we've seen, it is not a fact that a lower IQ means less intelligence. And there is even less evidence to show that intelligence is 80% inherited. Yet that percentage is the very basis of Jensen's argument. The same evidence that Jensen uses has been studied by psychologist Leon Kamen. Like most of his colleagues, he finds the conclusions unsound.
There's one fact that we all know and we all can agree upon. IQ test scores tend to run in families. Of that, there is no question. By and large, if you find parents with high IQ scores, their children will tend to have high IQs.
But pardon me for interrupting, but doesn't that serve to prove what Dr. Jensen has been saying? This is precisely the kind of information he cites.
It's precisely the kind of information he cites, but it certainly does not in any sense prove his interpretation. The point is this: parents pass on their genes to their children. They also pass on their culture, their knowledge, and their environment to their children. Rich parents tend to produce rich children. Well-educated parents tend to produce well-educated children. High IQ parents tend to produce high IQ children. Parents who like bagels and lox tend to produce children who like bagels and lox. It doesn't follow that those things are transmitted through the genes. The parent provides the child's environment just as he provides the child's genes. So when one finds that a child resembles his parents, one doesn't know whether that resemblance is due to the fact that he's inherited genes from the parents or due to the fact that he has learned an enormous amount from the parents.
It isn't some natural lack of intelligence, but a cultural handicap that holds poor children back. That was the idea behind federal programs of the 60s, such as Head Start, the programs of so-called compensatory education. The belief was that through special efforts, children from poor homes could be brought up to middle-class educational standards and would do well in school. Dr. Jensen was one of the early skeptics, and he remains just that.
I don't think there's evidence that compensatory education changes IQs. It may prepare children for better performance in school. That's a possibility. There's been very little demonstration even of that, however. But there are other possibilities, other benefits that may accrue to compensatory education, aside from any changes in IQ that could result. As far as I know, there's been no demonstration that IQs themselves have been changed, that basic intelligence has changed.
Jensen's arguments were welcomed in the upper reaches of the Nixon administration. They were used to support cutbacks in Head Start and other compensatory education programs on the grounds that not enough good was being done for the money spent. One problem was that while many youngsters did gain 5 or 10 IQ points while they were in Head Start, they gradually slipped back when they went on to regular classrooms. More recently, there have been federally funded programs like this one on Long Island, New York, which seem to contradict Professor Jensen. Training starts early, when the child is 2. It's done at home. A demonstrator visits twice a week with books and toys, encouraging the mother to use them, to read and talk to her child as a way to stimulate learning. The results? An average increase of 15 IQ points. Results that have encouraged the government to fund 30 more such projects around the country.
Big? That's small. That's small. Very small.
The program's director, Dr. Phyllis Levenstein.
On the IQ test, children tend to gain a very large number of IQ points after they've been in the program. They're tested before and afterwards. Gain enough IQ points to put them into, well, almost close to bright normal range, which is safely in the range of being able to learn to read once they get to school.
What exactly is this asking us to do, Roberta? Take off the Y and put an I-L-Y.
All right. Change the Y. So far, the children who have been in the full 2-year version of the program have retained almost all of the gains that they made in the program, so that by the time the first batch reached 2nd grade last year, They still had the same IQ that they had achieved in the program, almost the same IQ. And teachers rated them as having dramatically fewer problems than children who had not had the program.
So arguments over how early, how quickly, and how much IQs can be improved go on. On one important point, however, all but a few of the experts agree. Certainly over the span of a lifetime, an individual's IQ can change dramatically. And about the related myth that race is the determining factor in a person's capacity for intelligence, many people who have studied the issue closely are convinced that it, too, will eventually be discredited.
I would think that 50 years from now, the idea that the difference between whites and blacks in IQ test scores had anything to do with the genes will look as absurd to our descendants as the idea that the Italians and Poles and Jews were feeble-minded in 1921 looks to us today. But in the meantime, this has been a tragic aspect of the great IQ myth.
The myths about IQ would be harmless if not for the way the scores have been used in our society. IQ, as we've seen, is not really a measurement of some overall mental ability. It only measures certain kinds of skills and information. It isn't basically something you're born with. Mostly it's what you've learned. And it isn't necessarily permanent. By recent evidence, it can be improved with education. Of all the prevalent ideas about IQ, there's one that's perhaps the most persistent of all, and it's had the greatest impact on people's lives. That is the idea that IQ somehow can measure a person's potential, that it tells pretty much what can be expected of you as you go through life.
Look, the bottom one is definitely not convergent. It goes on and expands and it's divergent. The top one...
On the basis of IQ, the potential in this classroom is staggering. Every one of these pupils has an IQ of at least 135, which puts them in the category often defined as gifted. Here at St. Anne's, a private school in Brooklyn, New York, it's merely the minimum entrance requirement. St. Anne's is still rather experimental, but Headmaster Stanley Bosworth has little doubt about how its graduates will turn out.
They have gone to the 30 or so colleges in the United States which can really handle vast intelligence. What happens is they do extremely well, but more than well, they will have the vision, the double helix, the dream, and they will, with that dream, variously invent, create, dance, make music, make money, whatever it is they want to make. But what will happen will be something which is unique.
How do people with high IQs turn out? Well, there's a kind of IQ alumni club called Mensa, with an entrance requirement of 145. That's 10 points higher than St. Anne's School. At a meeting of the New York chapter, we canvassed the membership and found they had turned out to be practically anything. Teachers, plumbers, housewives, a lawyer, a real estate man, a professional belly dancer. Belly, not ballet. In the Dallas chapter of Mensa, we met a member named Homer DeWolf.
I could have been something other than a police officer if I had decided earlier in life. I've always done well on civil service type examinations and so on, but I was a true high school dropout when I was a youngster. I'd rather play than study. High IQ, I don't think, is really any more of a personal accomplishment than a person with a good physical ability. It's, to me, it's something that you're born with, and if you have it and know about it and take advantage of it, of course, it's to your benefit. If you don't, why, it's might be lost.
It's something you're born with. Even people with a high IQ misunderstand IQ. A man who could not have qualified for Officer DeWolf's IQ Club or St. Anne's School is Dr. James Watson, Nobel Prize winner as co-discoverer of DNA, the so-called secret of life, the double helix. His IQ is just 115, only high average. He doesn't dispute the score, just how much it means.
Those qualities which should sort of make you come up with something very new are very hard to measure, and it's almost unpredictable. The only thing which I guess gave me encouragement later in life is that people who are older somehow thought I had a future. I don't know why, but maybe it was because I asked questions and I was curious. That sort of persistent curiosity isn't shown by tests at all.
At Stanford University in California, a kind of IQ biography is being assembled. A follow-up on the lives of people who scored high on IQ tests back in the 1920s. Children who went on to become high school students and college students or dropouts, got jobs and started families, had their lives interrupted by World War II, became more or less successful in their careers. Careers now mostly approaching their end with retirement. In looking back over these lives, Stanford professor Lee J. Cronbach finds the ruling fact was not IQ.
We've been looking at who had the greatest success in life and the least success. The only thing that determines who comes out well in his contribution to society and the kind of life he lives is whether you get through college or not. There is a direct correspondence between the amount of education completed and your opportunities in the rest of your life, both as consumer and as producer. So that insofar as getting somewhere in the world, having jobs open to you, being considered for promotion, depends on how much schooling you get.
Professor David McClelland of Harvard explains to CBS News correspondent Robert Shackney, if IQ is not the key to success, then why are so many high IQ people successful?
Intelligence has a kind of secondary role there. You see, if you have a good intelligence test score, in the old days, you could get into a good school, which means you could get into a good law school, let's say the Harvard Law School, and if you got into a good Harvard Law School, you would get first crack at joining a prestigious firm on Wall Street. But that has nothing directly to do with intelligence. It's just that you're part of the old boy network, namely those people who score well on tests. And the factors I've been interested in are things like achievement motivation, the desire to do a good job, to improve at what you're doing. And this is far more important at predicting success than IQ tests. IQ tests have zero value for predicting how well a small businessman, for example, will do, or how well a salesman will do.
Does an IQ provide any information of real value about a person's ability?
Yeah, I think a very limited value, sure. I think it shows you some very limited specific abilities that are probably appropriate for certain occupations. Yes, I would say that.
Such as?
Very limited. Making up tests.
There are many occupations in which success depends on motivation plus certain specific skills, some of them mental but not usually covered on tests. Again, Professor Cronbach of Stanford.
It's not just what he knows, it's how well he addresses a task. Does he correct himself? Does he persist until he's got a solution? But there are a tremendous number of more specialized talents that have to come in. For example, the ability to deal with shapes, to carry a shape in your mind, to mentally turn it over. That's something that isn't very important in the general intelligence test, but for some jobs like draftsmen and machinists, that becomes very important.
IQ and jobs. The connection may be tenuous, but sometimes employers have made it crucial in ways that have brought the federal courts into the issue.
Now, look at the directions for part 1 on page 3. Read the directions to yourself while I read them out loud.
This IQ test is for a job, and it's legal, according to a 1971 decision of the Supreme Court. It's being given by the telephone company in Hempstead, New York. And the company had to certify that the test was directly related to the work the job seekers would be doing.
Click over to Carl Herman from Tom.
There are many jobs, however, for which IQ tests have been simply a cover for race discrimination. A utility lineman would hardly need to be good at word analogies. Neither would a policeman. Yet that's just the sort of test that has been required in the past by some police departments. It was a way of putting down minority group applicants. That's what the Supreme Court outlawed, legally writing off the myth that IQ measures a person's overall potential as an employee. Other myths about IQ are not so easily dislodged. In the schools where the tests are most widely used, the misuses are harder to pinpoint, harder to correct. We'll look at that subject next. For most American schoolchildren, IQ tests are an established fact of life, experienced as early as the first grade, to be faced 2 or 3 more times before the school years are over. Yet there are increasing doubts about IQ tests among the teachers who give them. Catherine Sennett of the Haggerty School in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Too many of us were measured by IQ scores in years gone by. Oh, she has an IQ of only 101. She's only expected to do less than so. Someone with an IQ of 101 could do a lot of things. They have the desire, the effort, the push, the drive. There's no reason why, oh, you're only expected to do 101's worth of IQ.
Professor McClellan of Harvard.
People develop expectations about how bright or how stupid people are based on these IQ scores. And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. The parent may get the idea that their kid is dumb because the school says so, or this IQ score says so. And then the parents and the teacher, the kid himself, all think he's a failure, and he's likely to be a failure.
Labeling is dreadful, as far as I'm concerned, in any shape, matter, or form, even in groups. Pretty soon the kids learn that the bluebirds are ahead of the beehives and the beehives are way behind the robins. So that avoid giving any kind of a label whatsoever. There's a stigma attached to it. And it's awfully hard to get rid of that stigma. Terribly hard.
In the upper grades, bluebirds and robins become fast track and slow track, high IQ and lower IQ. In 9th grade math, the fast track may be taking on advanced algebraic equations.
Z to the third, what property? Susan? -2 times y times y times y.
The slow track, meanwhile, may be struggling with simple fractions and other basic stuff. Not necessarily bad, except that in the lives of some children, the track has a way of becoming a rut.
Very good.
Psychologist Jane Mercer of Riverside, California.
And some of those tracks lead on to college and the professions. Other tracks do not. And once a child's moved into one of these lower tracks, it's very difficult for him to move across and to change. And so I feel that this has been, the use of tests have had, over the long run, a very important impact on maintaining the status differentials in the larger society as they now exist.
There are even more drastic consequences of labeling by IQ, and these have been brought to light by psychologist Mercer in a study of a California school district. A study prompted when she noticed that an extraordinary number of Mexican-American pupils had been classified as mentally retarded solely on the basis of their IQ scores.
When we looked at a subgroup of these children who had been labeled and placed in classes for the mentally retarded, we estimated that perhaps 75% of them were probably not mentally retarded in a clinical sense. They were children who came from a culturally different backgrounds, from Spanish-speaking backgrounds where they'd had little opportunity to learn what was in the test. But yet a decision was made because they made a low score on the test that they were mentally retarded, when in fact what was really being measured was cultural difference. In our study we found that because the schools were screening and picking up people using IQ tests, that once people get out of the public school, most of those who have been labeled as mentally retarded in the public school simply disappear into the population. They marry, they jobs, they no longer are thought of as mentally retarded by any of the people that they come in contact with.
We asked Dr. Mercer what the IQ test does tell us.
The IQ test measures how well a child's likely to do in an academic public school situation. It predicts who does well in this particular institution, the schools. It is not a very good predictor of who's going to do well interpersonally, who's going to do well as adults.
A man named Gregory Ochoa recalls the IQ test he took at school in California. That's how he came to be classified as mentally retarded.
I knew I was going to have trouble with the test because I couldn't read the words. I simply couldn't read and extract some meaning from the words. Some of us attempted to point this out to the teacher, to the psychologist, and he said, just do what you can do. Then we were told that As a result of this testing, we were going to be placed in a classroom commensurate with our skills and our capabilities. And that seemed okay to me on the face of it. I mean, I didn't understand yet the implications, but it seemed like it was okay. So they called off the names, and most of the names were like Martinez, Gonzalez, Jones, principally Spanish surnames. Well, the teacher turned out to be not a full-blown classroom teacher, but a kind of a coach. Well, we played a lot of soccer. None of us knew what it meant on the building, educably mentally retarded, or on letterheads and pieces of paper on the bulletin board and so forth. But that's essentially what we did. Any kind of individual effort for some kind of intellectual activity, like going to the school library, was pretty much out of bounds for us.
Ochoa was not one of the ones who disappeared into the population. Not for quite a while. First, he dropped out of school, then into reform school, where they gave him remedial reading. Then a hitch in the Navy.
When the Navy gave me a battery of examinations to determine what kind of job I would do in the Navy, they were really very pleased with the results, although they knew that I was mentally retarded. And they were really amazed at my intellectual capacity. They never told me what my IQ was on retesting or that my capability was exactly. They just said, there's very little that you can't do in the Navy if you want to do it.
One thing he did in the Navy was earn some high school credits. That got him into college, on probation.
In the first quarter, I got all A's. The second quarter, I got all A's. But I was still on probation. And I graduated from San Jose City College on the dean's list as an honors student on probation. They never really stopped thinking about me as being mentally retarded or some kind of a fluke.
Assistant Professor Gregory Ochoa, now 40, teaches a course in social casework at the University of Washington in Seattle.
There are three broad categories: the psychotic reactions, the neurotic reactions, and personality trait disorders.
In his case, the IQ test was worse than wrong.
In your view, is intelligence testing valid at all as a concept?
Well, not the way it's certainly put together now. I think, first of all, one would have to ask, well, why do you want to know what this individual's intellectual capacity is? Are you using it in order to make sure that every horizon available to him is reached, or are you using it to diminish his opportunities, or to prove to him or to oneself that blacks and Chicanos and other minorities are innately inferior to others? And I think that's really the critical issue. What is it being used for?
In California, as a result of the Jane Mercer study, the schools are no longer allowed to classify children as mentally retarded solely on the basis of IQ tests. That's in California. In many school districts in other states, the practice continues. The schools still live by, and children are sometimes branded by, the IQ myth. Considering how much harm has been done, socially, individually, by the misuse of IQ scores, it's no wonder that some psychologists and educators would like to abandon the tests altogether, maybe even outlaw them. From the other side, it's argued that the test can show a child's aptitude for schoolwork, an important part of life after all, and also can show where the child needs help. So that argument will probably go on for quite a while in educational circles. Meanwhile, there are some practical lessons in all this for us parents. First, if you have any reason to believe your child has been inaccurately classified on the basis of IQ tests, you now have a legal right to find out his or her score from the school. That's one form of secrecy that's breaking down. If it's a group test score, you can get it checked by an individual IQ test, though you might have to do that at your own expense with a private psychologist. Whatever your child's score, keep in mind, and try to have the child keep in mind, that it is not the whole story. It only measures a limited part of the person at one particular time in life. And as far as your children's future is concerned, a lot more seems to depend on motivation than on a high IQ. Finally, it would be well to keep in mind that all this is true not just for your own children, but for your neighbors. Black or white, rich, middle class, poor. For all of them, IQ is no natural talent, no godly gift, but something their family and their community have given them, or denied them. Dan Rather for CBS Reports. Good night.
Next page, quickly. I think you need a new one. right. Michael.
Zebra.
What letter? Right across the top row. Colin?
Zipper.
You skipped one.